Hi, this is Remembering the Past, the show where we talk about people who died recently who've had a profound effect on our history, our society, or our culture. Tonight we're going to talk about two institutions. The first is Ben Bradlee, who died recently at the age of 93. And Ben Bradlee was the executive editor of the Washington Post from 1968 to 1991. Ben Bradlee was responsible more than any other person for transforming the Washington Post from a non-essential local newspaper to a national and even international newspaper power. And he did that primarily on the basis of two stories, the Pentagon Papers during the Vietnam War, which we talked about before, and of course Watergate. And he was immortalized when he was played by Jason Robards in the movie All the President's Men. Wouldn't mind have Jason Robards playing me in a movie. Anyway, here's the voice of America on Ben Bradlee.
A revered newspaper editor, Benjamin Crowninshield Bradlee, believed in a healthy tension between inquisitive reporters and government officials.
They don't have to treat us all that well. We just have to stay out of the way.
Bradlee advanced that credo in a career that spanned 6 decades. A close friend of President John F. Kennedy, Bradlee experienced life as a White House favorite and later a perceived adversary. In 1971, he spearheaded a legal battle by the Post and the New York Times that culminated in a Supreme Court ruling allowing the newspapers to continue publishing the Pentagon Papers, a secret government accounting of America's involvement in Vietnam. A year later, two of his reporters, Bob Woodard and Carl Bernstein, published groundbreaking stories about the Nixon White House's attempted cover-up of a break-in at Democratic Party headquarters. The Watergate scandal forced President Nixon to resign in 1974.
I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.
In 2011, Woodward paid tribute to his old boss.
You were a great editor, not just because of what you published, but what you didn't publish. And you never said, we're not going to run this story ever. You said, I'm not yet convinced. We need more information. We need more sources.
For more than 30 years, Woodward, Bernstein, and Bradlee kept secret the identity of a key Nixon administration source on Watergate, former FBI Associate Director Mark Phelps.
I didn't tell my wife.
Bradlee also helped inspire a new generation of journalists eager to hold the government to account. Investigative reporter Dana Priest knew Ben Bradlee for nearly 3 decades.
He served as this critical spirit and soul of the newspaper. He loved the basics of what we do. He loved a good story. When he saw a good story, it was like he was part of that, and he would slap the desk, and he would come over and give you a big slap on the back, or he would tell a joke, or he was having so much fun doing his job. Ben Bradlee's legacy to all American journalism, not just the Washington Post, is the backbone that he had to take on the presidency. You need someone else outside of government to check what the government is doing.
Bradlee never doubted the value of his work.
I've been in this business a long time, and I cannot recall a case which we published which I could honestly say threatened the national security.
Bradlee fought for his country in World War II and for decades thereafter defended and advanced the independent news media.
His wife, by the way, was Sally Quinn, the author, journalist, and all-around power person in Washington, D.C. I think if there's a criticism of Ben Bradlee, it might be that he cozied up to the politicians that he liked, and he was a little hypercritical of the ones he didn't like. But hey, you can't knock 93 Pulitzers. Here's a snip from 60 Minutes where he talks about Watergate with Mike Wallace.
You don't edit a powerhouse newspaper like the Washington Post for more than 25 years without making both friends and enemies in high places. And in the town where Ben Bradlee plied his trade, there was, and there still is, no higher place than the White House, and no friend or enemy like the man who lives there, whether it's John Kennedy, who was one of his best friends, or Richard Nixon, who was one of his worst enemies. After all, it was Ben Bradlee's Washington Post that uncovered the Watergate scandal that sent Richard Nixon packing. That was more than a quarter of a century after Ben Bradlee, running Newsweek magazine's Washington bureau at the time, was asked to lunch by Katharine Graham, the publisher of the Post, and she asked him if he'd like to edit her newspaper.
He thought it over for a minute, and he said I'd give my left one to be editor of the Washington Post.
He got the job and went on to become one of the great editors of his generation. His biggest success, of course, came when the Post beat all the rest of us at uncovering President Nixon's Watergate cover-up.
Lied to the American public time and time. I want the American people, I want you to know beyond the shadow of a doubt that during my term as president, justice will be pursued fairly, fully, and impartially, no matter who is involved.
You knew he was lying at the time?
Yeah, I rest my case. We knew he was lying at the time. We had no idea how badly he was lying, but we knew that he was not going to pursue justice as impartially and fully as possible. I thank Richard Nixon. He put me on the map.
Well, no account of Ben Bradlee's life would be complete without a little bit from all the president's men. I see today that Robert Redford is taking credit for writing a lot of this stuff, but every reliable account I've seen says it was by the guy who got the original credit, William Goldman, one of the most brilliant screenwriters ever in Hollywood, a nice Jewish boy from Highland Park. This was William Goldman through and through.
Mitchell know he was talking to a reporter?
Yeah, but I think I woke him up.
He had good notes?
Verbatim.
He really said that about Mrs. Graham. You know, once when I was reporting, Lyndon Johnson's top guy gave me the word. They were looking for a successor for J. Edgar Hoover. I wrote it, and the day it appeared, Johnson held a press conference and appointed Hoover head of the FBI for life. When he was done, turned to his top guy, and the president said, "Call Ben Bradlee and tell him you." Well, everybody said, "You did it, Ben. You screwed up. You stuck us with Hoover forever." I screwed up, but I wasn't wrong. How much can you tell me about Deep Throat?
How much do you need to know?
You trust him?
Yeah.
I can't do the reporting for my reporters, which means I have to trust them. And I hate trusting anybody.
Little irony here, a Washington Post reporter about 5 years later got a Pulitzer Prize for an inner-city drama that she wrote about that it turned out she'd completely fabricated. If anything, that was a low point in Ben Bradlee's career, because until the very end, he trusted her. Anyway, some of the greatest dialogue ever written in movies is in All the President's Men, written by William Goldman, I hasten to add, and here's another scene with Jason Robards as Ben Bradlee.
You guys are probably pretty tired, right? Well, you should be. Go on home. Get a nice hot bath. Rest up 15 minutes. And get your asses back in gear. We're under a lot of pressure, you know, and you put us there. Nothing's riding on this except the First Amendment of the Constitution, freedom of the press, and maybe the future of the country.
And for those younger listeners out there, here's one of the most famous pieces of dialogue in movies. It doesn't involve Ben Bradlee strictly. It's Deep Throat. It turned out to be a disgruntled FBI agent, not exactly the angel he's portrayed in the movie.
Forget the myths the media's created about the White House. The truth is, these are not very bright guys, and things got out of hand.
Funds come in from the Cove. Supposedly he's got a lawyer with $25,000 in a brown paper bag.
Follow the money.
That is the original source of the phrase, follow the money. Here's Bob Woodward on Jason Robards and Ben Bradlee.
To the extent that anybody has a picture of him in the rest of the country, it's from the movie in which he was portrayed by Jason Robards as gruff, skeptical, but willing to let you and Carl Bernstein move ahead on the story. Was that the case?
Yeah, the movie version of All the President's Men has the feel right, and Robards playing Bradlee, it's like they're twins. One of the fascinating stories is when they were making the movie, and who do we get to play Bradlee? Well, director Alan Pakula and the actors knew Robards and said, you know, there's something about them that's the same. So they called Robards in and they gave him the script and said, we're going to pay you $50,000 to play Bradlee. And at this point, Robards was at a low point in his career. He had a drinking problem. Wow, $50,000. Took the script home, brought it back, said, I can't play Bradlee. He said, why? Well, read the script. All he does is run around and say, where's the effing story? And they said to him, look, that's what the editor of the Washington Post does.
They give him a line in the movie. I can't do the reporting for my reporters, which means I have to trust them, and I hate trusting anybody. Was that Bradlee?
Yeah, that was Bradlee.
We're going to move on now to another institution, the Wrigley Field Bleachers here in Chicago, which had been knocked down after 77 years. And by way of introduction, here's the late, great folk singer, one of my wife's favorites, Steve Goodman.
The Cubs made me a criminal. Well, that's what they did. They stole my youth from me. I'd forsake my teachers to go sit in the bleachers. In flagrant truancy.
Well, here's the obit that I wrote in the Chicago Tribune for the Wrigley Field Bleachers. In a quiet announcement from Wrigleyville, it was reported the Wrigley Field Bleachers have died at age 77. No cause of death was given, but it is believed the Bleachers died of complications of chronically poor Chicago Cubs play. Though they had been in failing health for some time in their younger days, the Bleachers lived a wild life of abandon and adventure. With ivy, hot dogs, and sunshine, not to mention lots of beer and an occasional toke of marijuana, the Bleachers courted players and fans alike. They rubbed shoulders with the great and the near great, including Jackie Robinson, Willie Mays, Roberto Clemente, Ron Santo, and Ernie Banks. Yet despite all those good times, the Bleachers ultimately lived a life of perennial frustration, desperately seeking a World Series ring from several suitors, only to be denied by the Fates, who appeared in various guises over the years. The roller coaster ride of thrills and disappointment began in 1938 when the Bleachers were only a year old. Cubs catcher Gabby Hartnett presented them with a dramatic ninth-inning home run in the September twilight, the legendary homer in the Glowman. That homer, which propelled the Cubs to the pennant, also hooked the Bleachers on baseball for the rest of their days. Their heyday, of course, was the 1960s and 70s, when they were considered a cheap date. For a couple of dollars, the Bleachers lured the willing with the promise of a suntan, a kiss, some alcohol, a little illicit gambling, and a baseball game thrown in for good measure. Who could refuse such an offer? Baby boomers flocked, and the Bleachers were touted by Harry Carey and Jack Brickhouse as the place to be seen in Chicago. The Bleachers became so popular they had their own cheerleaders, the Bleacher Bums. Wearing yellow hard hats, the Bums enforced bleacher etiquette and razzed other teams unmercifully. Woe to the outfielder of the opposition. The Bums heckled their baseball ability, girlfriends, wives, anything was fair game. Those were the halcyon days, and the Bleachers were immortalized in the story of those glorious years in the 1977 play Bleacher Bums. Written by Joe Mantegna and members of Chicago's Organic Theater Company, the play helped launch the careers of several famous actors, including Mantegna, Dennis Franz, Dennis Farina, and George Wendt. Yet despite all those superstar actors, they were nothing more than featured players. There was never any question. The star was the Bleachers. Even in middle age, beauty subtly fading, the Bleachers retained their come-hither charm. Younger suitors like Andre Dawson still came courting. On a memorable national television game in 1984, a handsome young Ryne Sandberg presented them with two late-inning home runs off the Cardinals' Bruce Sutter, a Chicago Cubs cast-off who became a Hall of Famer. For a brief moment, the blush was restored to the rose. And still that coveted World Series ring inevitably continued to elude the Bleachers. Not that they didn't have their chances. In 1938 and 1945, they were robbed by jealous suitors from New York and Detroit. In 1969, while they were still a star, they were undone by the upstart New York Mets. In 1984, a ground ball in San Diego went through an infielder's legs and ruined the engagement party they had planned. And the last, most unkind cut of all came in 2003 in the form of a young man with a set of earphones. When he innocently reached for a foul ball and destroyed their last hope, you could almost see the shoulders heave and the twinkle in the eye disappear. The final indignity was that the young fan wasn't even sitting in the bleachers. Death was just a matter of time. In their youth, the Bleachers courted football. The Bears played there, and the fans in the bleachers cheered Sid Luckman, Bronco Nagurski, Gale Sayers, and Dick Butkus. There were even decades when they saw the Bears throttle the Green Bay Packers with regularity. Yes, Virginia, there was such a time. They got NFL championship rings, but it wasn't the same as that World Series ring. During their dowager years, the Bleachers witnessed an ice hockey game courtesy of the Blackhawks, soccer matches, and even rock concerts starring the likes of Paul McCartney and Pearl Jam. But despite the excitement and allure of such events, the Bleachers weren't cut out for hockey, soccer, or Pearl Jam. It was nothing more than the last gasp of a geezer, trying desperately and in vain to stay young. The Bleachers leave no immediate survivors. Services have already been held. In lieu of flowers, hopes and prayers for a Cubs World Series can be sent to 1060 West Addison, care of Tom Ricketts and Theo Epstein. Unless, of course, you are a fan of the White Sox or St. Louis Cardinals. In that case, nothing is expected. But please remember the Latin phrase, de mortuis nil nisi bonum, speak no ill of the dead.
And as my last remains go flying over the left field wall, we'll bid the Bleacher Bums adieu. And I'll come to my final resting place, out on Waveland Avenue.
Well, I'm going to close on that note. I want to thank my producer, Sid Tepps, and of course the last word has to go to Steve Goodman and his brilliant A Dying Cub Fan's Last Request.
Do they still play the blues in Chicago when baseball season rolls around? When the snow melts away, do the Cubbies still play in their ivy-covered burial ground? When I was a boy, they were my pride and joy, but now they only bring fatigue to the home of the brave, the land of the free, and the doormat of the National League.